An entitled traveler thought he could scream at an elderly gate agent, shaming her in front of the entire terminal, without realizing that the pilot waiting in the cockpit, the man who would control his entire journey through the skies, was her son. It began with a thud. His gold-trimmed suitcase slammed against the counter, rattling the pens and startling the nervous passengers lined up behind him. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, washing everything in sterile white, but the sound of his arrogance cut through the air like a blade. He leaned forward, card flashing in his hand, as if the shiny plastic were a crown. "Move faster," he barked, his words echoing across the waiting area. "I don't have all day. Maybe if you weren't so old, these lines wouldn't be such a disaster." Gasps scattered through the terminal. A baby whimpered. A teenager shifted uncomfortably in his seat, earbuds dangling, yet no one stepped forward. All eyes turned to the woman behind the counter, whose face burned crimson under the weight of 100 stares. Ida adjusted her glasses with trembling fingers. Her hands hovered above the keyboard, steadying themselves like wings fighting against turbulence. She had worked this job for 35 years. She had seen impatience, annoyance, even the occasional cruel remark. But the man before her, the sharpness in his voice, the cruel pleasure in his smirk, pierced deeper than most. Her lips parted. "Sir, please," but he cut her off with a laugh. Loud, sharp, victorious. A laugh meant to humiliate, not to ease. Pathetic. "And they let you run a gate?" His voice carried, pulling in unwilling witnesses, feeding his pride on their silence. Ida swallowed her words. She knew the cost of talking back. The world did not forgive women like her for defending themselves, especially not women her age, her color, her softness. So she did what she had learned long ago. She kept her dignity quiet. She pressed her lips into a thin line, tapped the final command into the keyboard, and printed the boarding pass with precise, almost ceremonial movements. Her badge swung gently as she leaned forward, the plastic catching the glare of the lights. Below it, pinned to her blazer, sat a pair of small silver wings, dull with age but shining to her eyes. A gift from Malik, her son, the day he earned his first uniform. "Mama," he told her, placing the pin in her palm, "these wings are yours as much as mine. You gave me flight." The memory steadied her. She pressed the wings against her chest as she handed over the pass. The man snatched it from her hand without thanks. "Finally," he sneered, dragging his suitcase behind him, its wheels screeching across the tile like claws on glass. He strutted toward the gate, not realizing that arrogance had its own gravity, a weight that soon would pull him down. Around them, the silence broke. A woman whispered, "That was unnecessary." A husband muttered, "Disgraceful." But their voices were low, cautious, like people afraid of poking at fire. They watched the man march away, then turned their eyes back to phones, magazines, glowing screens. Nobody had defended her. Ida exhaled slowly, letting her pulse settle. She adjusted her glasses again and returned to her screen, pretending her ears hadn't burned, pretending her heart hadn't clenched. Pretending, because that was safer than anger. Yet inside, a quiet storm brewed. Not rage, no, something sharper. A certainty. The kind of certainty only a mother could carry. Because even now, her son sat 2 gates away, in the cockpit of Flight 227. Malik's uniform was crisp, his captain's bars gleaming, his voice calm as he checked charts and instruments. He didn't know yet what had happened at the counter, but he didn't need to. Malik carried his mother in everything he did. Her discipline, her patience, her pride. Her strength was stitched into his every decision. And soon, the man who had mocked her would step onto Malik's aircraft. Soon, arrogance would walk into her son's domain, a world where respect was no longer optional. Ida straightened her posture, folding her hands neatly on the counter. The sting of the insult lingered, but so did Malik's words from long ago. "Mama, when you wear those wings, you're flying too." The gate area buzzed again. Boarding announcements, shuffling feet, the rolling chorus of luggage wheels. The rhythm of the airport swallowed the moment, burying humiliation under routine. But Ida knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. Humiliation had been loud. Justice, she believed, would be silent, and it would soar higher than he could imagine. The man was gone, swallowed by the jet bridge, but the echoes of his voice still clung to the air like smoke after fire. The waiting area buzzed again with the shuffle of feet, the hum of phones, the crinkle of snack wrappers. But beneath it all, a current of whispers ran thin and sharp. "That was harsh," a young woman murmured, her hands folded around a paperback she no longer read. She glanced at the counter, where Ida sat upright, her eyes fixed on the monitor as if nothing had happened. But her flushed cheeks betrayed her silence. Two businessmen in matching suits shook their heads. One leaned toward the other, whispering just low enough. "Some people think money gives them a crown." A teenage boy, slouched in his hoodie, tugged out an earbud. "If my grandma worked here and somebody talked to her like that..." His words trailed off, swallowed by the tension of unspoken what-ifs. Passengers exchanged glances. Some looked away quickly, ashamed for having done nothing. Others lingered on Ida, watching her move with slow precision, scanning passes, answering questions, typing without pause, as if she were determined to prove that her dignity was unshakable. But whispers could not erase what had been seen. They carried fragments of judgment, yes, but also fragments of guilt. Nobody had stepped forward when she needed it. Nobody had spoken against the cruelty. They had let humiliation bloom unchecked in the heart of the terminal. Ida felt their eyes. She could hear the murmurs in the periphery, like faint winds against glass. She knew the pattern well. The cruel voice was always loudest. The sympathetic ones always came after, when the harm was already done. Still, she kept her head high. She adjusted her glasses with careful grace, greeted the next traveler with the same soft, practiced smile. Her badge swung gently, her silver wings pinned glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. She would not let them see her break. In the corner, an older woman clutched her husband's arm. "She reminds me of Rosa at the hospital," she whispered. "Worked twice as hard for half the thanks." Her husband nodded, his jaw tight, his silence an apology he could not give aloud. Farther down, a mother leaned close to her daughter, voice low. "That's why we treat people kindly. You never know their story." The little girl nodded, her wide eyes fixed on Ida as if she were more than just a gate agent, perhaps a warning, perhaps an example. But the man who had caused it all was gone, striding down the jet bridge without a backward glance, convinced of his victory. The gate agents nearby exchanged subtle looks, quiet communications born of years together in uniform. One of them mouthed, "Are you okay?" Ida gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried both reassurance and finality. She would not invite pity. She did not need their sympathy. She had her wings. Still, when the boarding line thinned and the terminal quieted, Ida allowed herself a breath she had been holding since his voice first cracked through the air. She placed her hand over her badge, pressing lightly against the silver wings. The metal was cool against her palm, grounding her, reminding her of Malik. At that very moment, Malik sat in the cockpit, unaware. His co-pilot joked lightly about the weather, flipping switches with an ease born of years, while Malik's eyes stayed sharp on the instruments. To him, it was another day, another flight, another set of lives in his hands. But to Ida, he was always her boy, the boy who used to sit cross-legged on the floor, folding paper airplanes, saying, "One day, Mama, I'll fly for real." The whispers in the terminal carried on. Some faded quickly, replaced by the practical chatter of boarding numbers and seat rows. But for a few passengers, the scene lingered like a stone in the shoe, impossible to forget. They had seen arrogance strip away humanity, and they had seen dignity hold its ground without raising a hand. It would not be the last time they thought about it, because stories like these had a way of clinging to people, resurfacing later, at dinner tables, in classrooms, in quiet moments when someone wondered what they might have done differently. And as Ida gathered the last stack of boarding passes and prepared to close the gate, a faint smile tugged at her lips, not because she had forgotten the humiliation, but because she knew something the traveler did not. He believed the story ended at the counter. He thought he had silenced her, but justice had already taken its seat in the cockpit, and once the plane left the ground, the balance of power would shift in ways he could not imagine. The gate was closed, the final passenger swallowed by the narrow mouth of the jet bridge. Ida pressed the button that locked the door, the mechanism clicking with a sound that always felt final, like sealing away a chapter. Around her, the terminal thinned into silence. Her co-workers moved quickly, printing final manifests, updating screens, but Ida lingered at her counter, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface as though she were erasing invisible bruises left by the traveler's voice. To them, she was just another uniform. A polite smile, a quiet greeting, a pair of hands that moved with practiced efficiency. But beneath the blazer, beneath the badge and the wings, lived decades of stories, sacrifices, and a resilience too deep for strangers to measure. Ida had not chosen this life because it was easy. She had chosen it because it was steady, because it offered health insurance, because it meant her boy could have shoes that fit, and books that opened doors wider than the small apartment they once called home. She had stood at counters when her feet ached, smiled when her heart was breaking, swallowed insults from impatient travelers because the paycheck meant food on the table and gas in the tank. There had been winters when she walked to work in the snow because the car wouldn't start, her gloves too thin, her coat too old. Summers when the heat of the terminal made sweat pool beneath her collar. But still she stood straight, answering the same questions 100 times, never letting exhaustion bleed into her voice. And through it all, Malik had watched. He had been just a boy when he first noticed how people spoke to his mother, how some called her sweetheart, with condescension dripping like syrup, how others barked orders as though she were less than human. He had seen her lower her head, not because she believed their words, but because survival demanded silence. One night, after she came home late with swollen ankles, Malik found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands cupping a mug of tea gone cold. "Mama," he had asked softly, "why do you let them talk to you like that?" She had looked at him then, her eyes tired but steady, and said, "Because if I fight every battle, son, I won't have strength left for the war that matters." He hadn't understood at the time, but years later, when he wore his own uniform and people addressed him as Captain Idris Malik Johnson, the weight of her words settled in his chest like an anchor. His mother had given him the sky by carrying the weight of the ground. Now, at the gate, Ida lifted the stack of unused boarding passes and slid them into a neat pile. Her co-workers didn't ask about the outburst she'd endured. They knew her well enough to understand she would never complain, never escalate. That wasn't her way. Still, the silver wings at her chest glinted faintly under the light, catching her eye like a reminder. Malik's gift. The proof that dignity endured longer than cruelty. She thought of him now, sitting in the cockpit just beyond the sealed door, running through his checklist with calm precision. She imagined his hands steady on the controls, his voice steady in the headset, his heart steady because he had grown up learning steadiness from her. Every sacrifice, every double shift, every insult swallowed, every night spent sewing patches on his jeans instead of sleeping, had led to this, to him, to Malik in the captain's seat, carrying her legacy higher than the traveler who had mocked her could ever reach. She pressed her palm gently against her badge, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. "Fly safe, baby," she murmured, her voice too soft for anyone else to hear. At the far end of the terminal, the whispers of earlier still lingered. A few passengers who had witnessed the scene glanced back at her one last time before disappearing toward baggage claim or connecting flights. They would carry her face with them, her quiet endurance burned into their memory. Some would forget by morning, others would remember for years. But Ida did not think about them. She thought only of Malik. The traveler believed his cruelty was the story. He thought humiliation had been the ending. But Ida knew better. She had lived long enough to understand that life carried reversals like hidden luggage, and arrogance always weighed more than it appeared. And now, as her son prepared to lift hundreds of lives into the sky, including the man who had spat venom at her, Ida allowed herself the faintest smile, because destiny, like flight, always found its way upward. The cockpit was alive with quiet electricity. Screens glowed in soft green, switches clicked under practiced fingers, and the low hum of systems warming for flight filled the narrow space. Malik sat in the captain's seat, posture straight, uniform immaculate, his captain's bars catching a faint glimmer from the overhead lights. To the passengers waiting beyond the gate, he was a stranger hidden behind a locked door. But to Ida, he was everything. Her son, her pride, her answer to every sacrifice she had ever made. "Pre-flight checklist complete," his co-pilot Jensen announced. His tone was casual, steady, the voice of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Malik nodded, running his eyes over the instruments anyway. He was not a man who trusted shortcuts. His mother had raised him to believe that thoroughness was not just discipline, it was respect. Respect for the work, Respect for the people who depended on him. Respect for himself. Copy that, Malik replied. His voice was calm, warm, with an edge of quiet authority that came not from arrogance but from certainty. Let's taxi on schedule. He adjusted his headset, the padded band pressing against his close-cropped hair. Outside the windshield, dusk was settling, the runway lights blinking like stars lining the earth. He always loved this moment, when the ground seemed to melt into the sky, when the world outside felt suspended between two realms. Yet behind the professionalism, Malik carried something heavier. He carried memory. He remembered nights as a boy, waiting up for his mother when her shift stretched late, the sound of her keys rattling at the door, the tired slump of her shoulders as she stepped inside, the way she smiled anyway when she saw him awake. He remembered the small kitchen where she'd boil rice and beans, humming softly as she cooked, even when her ankles were swollen and her back ached. He remembered her hands, strong, brown, lined with years of labor, as they fixed his school tie or bandaged a scraped knee. Those hands had shaped him. Those hands had given him the sky. Now, sitting in the captain's seat, Malik glanced down at the small silver wings pinned discreetly inside his jacket pocket. They were not regulation, but he carried them always. His mother's pin, the same one she wore now on her blazer at the gate, a reminder that he did not fly alone. Passengers almost boarded, Jensen said, glancing at the digital manifest. We've got a full cabin tonight. Malik nodded. His eyes lingered on the list of names. A sea of strangers, each with a story, each trusting him to carry them safely through the air. He never forgot that trust. To him, every passenger was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. The responsibility humbled him, grounded him even as he prepared to ascend thousands of feet above the earth. What he did not know, what fate had carefully hidden for now, was that among those names sat one belonging to the man who had spat cruelty at his mother only minutes earlier, the man who strutted down the jet bridge believing his power had silenced her. Malik adjusted the throttle with steady hands. His life had taught him that silence was never weakness. He had seen his mother turn silence into armor, patience into strength, humility into triumph. And though he could not hear the whispers still drifting through the terminal, though he did not see Ida's quiet smile as she closed her counter, he carried her with him into the cockpit. Jensen leaned back with a sigh. You ever get tired of this part? The waiting? Malik allowed himself the faintest grin. I watched my mother work 30 years without complaint. Compared to her, this is nothing. Jensen chuckled, shaking his head. You always got a story about her. I always will, Malik said softly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Everything I am came from her. Outside, the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon. The cabin crew prepared the final passengers, guiding them into their seats. The jet bridge groaned as it retracted. Soon, the doors would seal. Soon, the engines would roar. Malik breathed deeply, steady and calm, unaware that arrogance had already boarded his plane. The same arrogance that had tried to strip his mother's dignity now sat strapped in a leather seat behind him, trusting him for survival. And the sky, vast and impartial, waited for justice to unfold. The traveler walked down the narrow jet bridge with the swagger of someone who believed the world bent to his schedule. His suitcase wheels rattled loudly against the metal floor, echoing in the tight corridor, announcing his presence as though the passengers ahead of him were an audience to his importance. He held his boarding pass like a ticket to royalty, chin high, lips curved in the faint smirk of a man who had just won a private war. No one else knew he was fighting. Inside the aircraft, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of recycled oxygen and fabric cleaner. The cabin crew greeted passengers with polite smiles, their voices practiced in the rhythm of welcome. Good evening, sir. Seat 3A is just up front. Obviously, he muttered, brushing past the attendant as though her kindness were an inconvenience. He hoisted his suitcase into the overhead compartment with a grunt, snapping it shut harder than necessary. Then he slid into his seat, stretching his legs, already tugging at the armrest with possessive impatience. He rang the call button before the attendant even had time to move away. Champagne, he said flatly when she returned. And cold. The attendant nodded with quiet professionalism, though her jaw tightened. She moved down the aisle to continue greeting passengers, her smile unfaltering, but her mind marking his face as one to watch. Behind him, A family settled into their row with soft laughter. A mother adjusted her child's blanket, whispering comfort as the little boy yawned. A young couple exchanged glances filled with anticipation, their whispered plans for vacation mingling with the buzz of the cabin. Life filled the plane, ordinary, fragile, trusting life, all placed unknowingly in the hands of the man behind the locked cockpit door, Malik. Up front, Malik adjusted his headset, his voice calm as he communicated with the control tower. Flight 227 ready for departure, all passengers on board. The traveler in 3A sipped his champagne, the cold fizz sharp on his tongue. He glanced around with the satisfaction of a man who believed the world had delivered him exactly what he deserved. First-class comfort, obedient staff, and the silence of victory. He had barked at an old woman, and she had shrunk away. To him that was proof of dominance, proof that the universe still revolved in his orbit. But the universe has a way of bending in silence, of preparing storms beneath calm skies. The seatbelt sign chimed. Passengers shuffled, stowing bags, settling into positions of stillness. Children pressed their faces against windows, eyes wide with wonder at the runway lights flickering outside. The cabin crew moved gracefully through their safety demonstration, arms gesturing with practiced precision. Most passengers half-watched, distracted, already drifting into their own worlds of music, books, and whispered conversations. The traveler ignored it entirely, scrolling through his phone, tapping impatiently when the Wi-Fi hadn't yet connected. In the cockpit, Malik's voice came steady over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 227. We are on schedule for an on-time departure. Weather looks clear, and we'll be cruising at 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and we'll have you safely to your destination." Passengers listened with varying attention, some comforted by the confidence in his tone, others too distracted to notice. But for the traveler in 3A, it was just background noise, a voice that meant nothing. He didn't care who the pilot was. To him, pilots were like chauffeurs, necessary, invisible. If only he knew. Because the voice he dismissed so casually belonged to the son of the woman he had just tried to break. The same voice that had once whispered promises in a cramped apartment. "One day, Mama, I'll carry you above all of this." The same voice that had grown from a boy folding paper airplanes into a man commanding hundreds of tons of steel through the sky. The traveler leaned back, sipping again, eyes closing with smug satisfaction. He believed his story was over, that he had won his battle at the counter. But the true story had only just begun. The engines roared to life, a low vibration running through the cabin floor. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, slowly, gracefully, like a giant awakening. Passengers hushed instinctively, some gripping armrests, some smiling with childlike awe. Malik rested his hand on the throttle, steady as always. For him, this moment was never routine. Each departure was a promise, each ascent a trust renewed. He thought briefly of his mother, imagining her finishing her shift, perhaps sipping tea in the break room, her feet aching, but her heart steady. He carried her with him into every flight. He didn't know that the echo of her humiliation was seated only a few feet behind him, and the sky, vast and impartial, was about to witness the meeting of arrogance and legacy. The plane rumbled forward, engines rising to a thunder that vibrated through the cabin walls. Passengers fell quiet, some clutching armrests, some closing their eyes as the runway lights streaked by like falling stars. The aircraft surged, nose lifting, weight pressing down on bodies as gravity resisted the climb. Then, with a smooth shiver, the plane broke free from the ground. Applause scattered in the back rows, timid and brief. Children giggled, pointing at the shrinking world below. For a moment there was wonder. For a moment, there was silence. Until the sharp ding of the call button shattered it. Row 3A. The attendant, Grace, approached with the kind of patience only years in uniform could teach. She bent slightly, her smile warm, though her eyes already braced. "Yes, sir? What can I get you?" The traveler adjusted his cufflinks, his lips curling. "I ordered champagne. This is warm." He thrust the glass toward her as if it were poison. "Do you think I paid for this seat to drink something lukewarm?" Grace inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. "I'll bring you a fresh one, sir. And make sure it's not from the cheap bottle you serve in economy," he added, his voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I know the tricks." Grace nodded once. taking the glass. She walked back down the aisle, her spine straight, her steps graceful, though her thoughts burned. Passengers exchanged looks, quiet disapproval tightening their lips. The family in row 4 whispered among themselves, the mother shaking her head. The traveler reclined fully, legs sprawling into the aisle, tapping impatiently at his phone, though the Wi-Fi had not yet connected. He sighed dramatically, as if the air itself conspired against him. When Grace returned with a chilled glass, he took it without thanks. He sipped, grimaced. Barely better. "Don't you people take pride in your work?" Nearby, a young woman couldn't help herself. "She's doing her job just fine," she said, voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly on her armrest. The traveler turned, his smile sharp as glass. "Excuse me? You don't have to be rude," she replied, quieter now, but unwilling to retract. His laugh was short and cruel. "Stay in your lane, sweetheart. Some of us expect a certain level of service." The woman sank back, cheeks flushing, her courage crumbling under the weight of his dismissal. Grace intervened quickly. "Sir, is there anything else I can assist you with?" Her voice was calm, her professionalism unbroken. The traveler waved her off. "Just don't mess up again." He sipped smugly, convinced he had reclaimed dominance. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably, resentment thickening the air. No one wanted confrontation at 35,000 feet. Yet every eye that glanced toward him carried the same thought. Arrogance is a fragile crown. Up front, Malik guided the aircraft through smooth skies. The hum of engines was steady. The horizon stretched endless and calm. He couldn't hear the tension brewing behind the cockpit door. To him, the cabin was a quiet trust. Souls carried in his care. He didn't know that one of those souls was poisoning the air with cruelty. But the universe had a way of aligning truths. Malik's mother's humiliation still clung to the traveler like an unseen shadow. And now, high above the earth, arrogance had nowhere to hide. The plane cruised on, its path steady, but inside the cabin the atmosphere was shifting. Passengers whispered again, discontent shared in glances, tension coiling tight, and Grace, collecting empty glasses with calm hands, pressed her lips together in silence. She would not raise her voice. She didn't need to, because she knew the captain. And though the traveler in 3A did not yet realize it, he had already walked into the one place where his arrogance could no longer shield him. The sky was impartial, but justice had passengers. The sky stretched endless above them, a velvet canvas pricked with fading stars. Flight 227 cruised smoothly, engines purring steady as Malik's hands rested light on the yoke. To most, this was routine, another trip between departure and destination. But for Malik, every flight was sacred. Each takeoff carried the weight of trust. Each landing was a silent promise kept. He glanced at the small silver wings tucked discreetly inside his jacket pocket, his mother's pin, the one he carried on every flight, pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. He never told the airline about it, never showed it to passengers or colleagues. It was private, intimate, a secret reminder that he did not sit in this cockpit alone. Malik's co-pilot adjusted switches, humming quietly to himself, but Malik's mind drifted backward. He saw his mother's hands, rough from years of work, guiding his smaller ones over paper as they folded makeshift airplanes at the kitchen table. "Balance, baby," she'd say. "If one wing is heavier than the other, it won't fly right." She wasn't just teaching him about paper. She was teaching him about life. He remembered school mornings when she'd braid his hair quickly before her shift, whispering encouragement, even though exhaustion lingered in her eyes. He remembered late nights when she sat with bills spread across the table, her lips moving in silent calculation, always making the numbers stretch further than seemed possible. And he remembered the day she took him to the airport to watch real planes take off. He was 10, his face pressed to the glass, eyes wide as a metal giant thundered into the sky. "One day," he whispered. She looked down at him, smiled tired but proud. "Then one day it will be." That day had carried him here, to this seat, to this responsibility. Every passenger in the cabin behind him, every stranger with their hopes, fears, and fragile humanity, was in his care because his mother had never let him forget his worth. The radio crackled with routine communication from air traffic control. Malik responded calmly, his voice smooth, precise, steady. Every word he spoke carried her influence. Her patience was in his tone, her discipline in his movements, her dignity in his silence. Jensen, the co-pilot, stretched slightly. "You ever think about what it costs to get here?" Malik turned, eyebrow raised. "What do you mean?" "The training, the hours, the sacrifice. You gave a lot." Malik shook his head. "I didn't give half as much as my mother did. She paid in ways no paycheck can repay." Jensen studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, sensing the gravity in Malik's words. Some people carried ambition. Others carried legacy. Malik carried both. Behind the cockpit door, the traveler in 3A shifted impatiently, ringing the call button again. He demanded more champagne, complained about legroom, rolled his eyes at the safety demonstration replayed on screens. He believed the flight was his stage, the crew his servants. But Malik, separated by steel and silence, was untouched by the man's arrogance. He was thinking only of his mother. He wondered if she was resting now, her shift done, her feet soaking in warm water the way she liked. He hoped she was smiling. He did not know she had been humiliated minutes before his flight. He did not know that the very man disturbing his crew was the same one who had tried to strip his mother's dignity. But the truth was waiting, and when it arrived, Malik would not need to raise his voice. He would not need to match cruelty with cruelty, because legacy spoke louder than arrogance. The plane hummed on, a steel bird gliding over clouds, carrying hundreds of lives stitched together by chance. Some slept, some read, some whispered to seatmates. But above them all, Malik carried the weight of his mother's sacrifice like an invisible crown. And in row 3A, arrogance sat oblivious, sipping champagne, unaware that he was trapped in the story of a woman he thought he had broken. The legacy of Ida Johnson had already boarded, and it was flying the plane. In row 3A, the traveler leaned back with his glass of champagne, smirking as if the sky itself had risen to serve him. His reflection glimmered faintly in the darkened window, a silhouette framed by clouds and moonlight. To the strangers around him, he was just another difficult passenger. But to himself, he was proof of victory, living evidence that money and power bent the world into submission. His name was Derek Whitfield. Born into comfort, raised on entitlement, Derek had grown up in a house where voices rarely said no. His father was a banker who measured love in allowances and lectures. His mother a socialite who believed appearances mattered more than truth. By the age of 12, Derek had learned that shouting got results, that patience was for the powerless, that apologies were for the weak. He remembered a dinner party once, the kind with long tables, crystal glasses, and laughter that echoed too loudly. The waiter, a young black man, nervous and hurried, spilled a splash of wine on Derek's new shirt. Derek's father didn't scold the waiter. He scolded Derek for reacting too softly. "Don't let them think you're beneath them," his father hissed. "You control people by reminding them of their place." The words rooted deep, shaping him like vines choking a tree. By high school, Derek was known less for grades and more for bravado. He bullied teachers into bending rules, threatened classmates with his father's influence, wore arrogance like armor. College only sharpened the edges. Wealth cushioned every consequence. Professors tolerated his demands. Women endured his condescension. Friends circled him for status, not affection. By the time Derek entered business, his personality had calcified. Deals weren't collaborations, they were conquests. Employees weren't colleagues, they were pawns. He measured worth in who stepped aside when he barked, who lowered their eyes when he glared. Airports became his favorite stage. They represented order, schedules, lines, things meant for ordinary people. But with his platinum card and executive status, Derek believed he was above it all. He relished skipping lines, relished watching others wait while he breezed through. And when delays occurred, when human error interrupted his seamless world, he struck, always at those who couldn't fight back. Desk agents, flight attendants, service staff. To him, they were faceless, replaceable. The outburst at the gate tonight had not been his first. It was a pattern, honed over years, a performance rehearsed to perfection. Each time he left feeling taller, stronger, reassured that he still ruled the invisible hierarchy he had built in his mind. But what Derek did not understand, what he had never understood, was that dignity did not need applause, and respect was not granted by money. He sipped his champagne again, swirling it in the glass as though it were rare vintage. though he barely tasted it. His gaze swept over the cabin. The family in row 4 now dozing, the young couple whispering, the woman who had dared defend the attendant shrinking back into her novel. To Derek, they were scenery. He was the main act. His phone buzzed uselessly in airplane mode. He scowled, tapping it against the armrest, already rehearsing the complaint he would file with the airline when he landed. People like him thrived on leverage. Complaints meant vouchers, free upgrades, apologies written in corporate tone. He collected them like trophies. He had no idea that his greatest humiliation was waiting, stitched invisibly into this very flight. Because arrogance blinds. It convinces men like Derek that the world is permanent, that their crown will never slip, that they are untouchable. But crowns made of arrogance crack at altitude. And tonight, at 35,000 feet, Derek's would begin to crumble. The plane cut smoothly through the night, its wings slicing clouds like silver blades. Inside the cabin, lights dimmed to a soft glow, casting everything in shades of blue and gold. Most passengers settled into the rhythm of flight. Books opened, headphones hummed, pillows tucked beneath tired heads. There was a hush, a fragile peace that only existed at 35,000 feet. But peace had no place in row 3A. Derek shifted noisily, his seat creaking as he stretched into the aisle again. He jabbed the call button with the impatience of a king summoning servants. Grace, the attendant, appeared within seconds, her professional smile unwavering, though her heart sank at the sight of him. "What now, sir?" she asked gently. "My blanket," Derek snapped. "It's too thin. This is first class, not a cheap motel." "I can bring you an extra one," Grace offered. "You'll bring me 2, he corrected, smirking as though he had scored a victory. Grace nodded, retrieved them, draped them carefully. Derek grunted approval, pulling them over his legs like a conqueror adorned in robes. Nearby, passengers exchanged quiet looks. A man in row 2 muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." The young woman from earlier, who had dared defend Grace once, kept her eyes firmly on her book, unwilling to ignite his wrath again. 10 minutes later, the call button chimed again. This time, Derek demanded his meal early. "I don't care what the service schedule is," he said. "I eat when I'm hungry. That's what I paid for." Grace explained gently that the ovens were still heating. Derek leaned closer, his breath heavy with champagne, and hissed, "Do I need to remind you who I am?" Grace stepped back, professional mask unbroken. "No reminder necessary, sir. I'll check with the galley." Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their silence thick with shared disapproval. But again, no one intervened. Not here. Not in the sealed tube of air where confrontation could spiral. The family in row 4 tried to distract their children with coloring books. The young couple whispered more loudly now, irritation breaking through their earlier tenderness. Even the businessman across the aisle from Derek sighed, closing his laptop with exaggerated force as if to make a point. But Derek noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed, and simply didn't care. To him, their discomfort was proof of his dominance. The world revolved as long as people gave way. The engines droned steadily, a lullaby for some, a curtain of sound for others. Malik's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Weather ahead is clear. We'll be landing on time." Passengers relaxed at the sound, some smiling faintly, comforted by the confidence. But Derek rolled his eyes. "He sounds young," he muttered to no one in particular. "Hope the kid knows what he's doing." The words floated across the cabin, sharp enough for several to hear. The businessman in row 2 clenched his jaw. The young couple whispered, "What a jerk." But still, silence ruled. Grace delivered Derek's meal early. Salmon, rice, vegetables plated neatly. He poked at it with disdain. Dry. Typical airline food. "You'd think with what I pay." His words trailed off into a familiar litany of complaints, as if the sound of his own dissatisfaction nourished him more than the food ever could. Hours stretched. Some passengers slept. Some stared out at the moonlit clouds. But in row 3A, Derek remained restless, his arrogance loud even in the quiet. He interrupted attendance, monopolized space, sighed dramatically whenever he wasn't the center of attention. What he didn't know, what none of the passengers knew, was that every moment brought him closer to the inevitable revelation. He believed he had claimed the night, bending crew and silence alike to his will. But arrogance was only noise. Legacy was thunder waiting behind the clouds. And at the front of the plane, Malik guided the aircraft with steady hands, his mother's wings pressing against his chest like a silent oath. Two worlds were crossing the skies together, one built on cruelty, the other on sacrifice. Their collision was inevitable. Hours into the flight, the cabin was wrapped in muted stillness. Most passengers slept, heads tilted against seats, mouths slightly open. The hum of engines filled the air like a steady heartbeat. Derek, however, was wide awake. He had grown restless, tired of champagne, tired of blankets, tired of not being the center of attention. He pressed the call button again, smirking when Grace appeared almost instantly. "Yes, sir? I want to know who's flying this plane," Derek said suddenly, his tone half curious, half mocking. The voice sounded young and inexperienced. Grace's smile tightened. "Our captain tonight is very experienced, sir. You're in excellent hands." "That so?" Derek drawled. "What's his name?" Grace hesitated. Crew were trained not to share too much, but Derek's tone was demanding, entitled, the kind that pressed people into corners. Finally, she replied, "Captain Malik Johnson." The name slid through the air like a whisper meant for fate itself. Derek froze, the sound tugging at something he hadn't expected. Johnson? The name flickered in his memory, dragging him back to the counter, to the badge he had mocked, to the trembling woman whose face had flushed red as he belittled her. He remembered the plastic tag. I. Johnson. His smirk faltered. Grace, misreading his silence as disinterest, nodded politely. "Can I bring you anything else, sir?" "No," Derek muttered, waving her away. She moved down the aisle, leaving him in the dim glow of his own unraveling thoughts. Johnson. Could it be coincidence? He leaned back, mind racing. He saw her again, the silver wings pinned to her blazer, her quiet composure as he spat cruelty at her. He remembered the way she had pressed her hand to that pin, as though drawing strength from it. Wings. Johnson. Captain Johnson. A cold ripple spread through him. He turned toward the window, but the reflection staring back carried no smugness now. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, his breath came shallow. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as common coincidence. But deep inside, arrogance faltered under the first weight of truth. If it was true, if the pilot was her son, then at this very moment, the man he had humiliated by proxy carried his life in his hands. The engines droned, steady and calm. The seatbelt sign glowed faintly above. Passengers slept, unaware that in row 3A, a man's certainty was cracking. Derek clenched his fists. He told himself it didn't matter. Pilots were professionals. They wouldn't risk a plane over personal grudges. But the thought looped in his mind. What if he knows? What if she told him? Every bump of turbulence, every shift in altitude became sharper, more personal. Was it normal? Or was it punishment? He glanced down the aisle, half expecting the captain to step out, to face him, to name him for what he had done. But the cockpit door remained closed, silent and impenetrable. Still, the truth pressed closer. The woman he had mocked was not just an old gate agent to be dismissed. She was the mother of the man flying this plane, the man with authority, the man with power, the man whose silence now carried more weight than Derek's shouting ever could. For the first time in years, Derek felt something unfamiliar gnaw at him. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The cockpit was quiet except for the steady hum of instruments and the occasional crackle of radio chatter. Malik's hands rested lightly on the controls, his eyes focused on the horizon. To him, this was another flight, a duty he carried with calm precision. But behind him, in row 3A, a storm brewed inside a man who had built his life on false crowns. Derek shifted uncomfortably, pulling his blankets tighter though the cabin was warm. His thoughts circled endlessly. Johnson, the badge, the wings, the name of the captain. It couldn't be coincidence. Fate wasn't that cruel. Or perhaps it was. He rang the call button again, more urgently this time. Grace appeared, her smile thinner than before. "Yes, sir?" Derek leaned close, lowering his voice. "This... Captain Johnson. How long has he been flying?" Grace blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Over 10 years, sir. He's one of our best." Derek's throat tightened. "A decade. More than enough time for the boy of a hardworking gate agent to rise, to claim the sky. He nodded stiffly, dismissing her with a wave, but his hand trembled. Passengers nearby noticed. They exchanged glances, confusion etched on their faces. This was not the same man who had barked orders and mocked the crew. Something had shifted. Malik's voice soon filled the cabin again, calm, steady, powerful without effort. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. We'll be landing on time. But for now, sit back and enjoy the flight. Remember, you are in safe hands." The words echoed through the speakers, but in Derek's ears, they carried another meaning. Safe hands. His hands. The sun's hands. The hands that could guide or destroy. Derek swallowed hard, his arrogance cracking further. He thought of the way he had leaned over the counter, voice dripping with venom, mocking the woman whose only crime was moving too slowly for his liking. He thought of her silence, not weakness, but dignity. He thought of the silver wings she pressed against her chest, wings that had now found their echo in the cockpit. Around him, passengers relaxed at Malik's voice, lulled by the confidence. But Derek sat stiff, hands gripping his armrests, sweat beating at his temple. He could not relax. He could not escape the invisible gaze of justice. The plane dipped slightly, a normal adjustment. But Derek jolted, eyes wide. Was it deliberate? Was Malik sending a message? Every movement of the aircraft became personal, every vibration a warning. And yet, Malik remained silent. He didn't need to confront Derek face to face. His power was greater than words. He commanded the sky. He commanded every breath in that cabin. For the first time in his life, Derek understood what true control looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't humiliate for sport. It was quiet, steady, absolute. The arrogance that had once filled him now shrank, hollow and trembling. And Ida, his victim, the woman he had mocked, did not need to speak. She had already won, because her son's silence carried louder than Derek's shouting ever could. Derek had always believed fear was for other people, for the weak, for the ones who stood in lines while he cut ahead, for the ones who bowed their heads while he barked orders. But now, somewhere high above the earth, fear crept into him like cold seeping under a locked door. His champagne glass trembled in his hand. He set it down too quickly, liquid sloshing onto the tray. He dabbed it with a napkin, but the stain spread anyway, a small, humiliating reminder that even control could spill. The name still echoed in his mind. Johnson. He tried to reason with himself. It could be coincidence. A common name. The world was full of Johnsons. But no matter how many times he repeated the excuse, the image of the gate agent's trembling hands, her quiet dignity, and the silver wings pinned to her blazer rose up to silence him. He shifted again in his seat, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. The businessman across the aisle glanced at him, brows raised, but Derek turned away, his eyes fixed on the dark window. The clouds below looked endless, merciless, like an ocean he could drown in. The call button glowed above him, but for once, Derek didn't press it. He didn't want the attendance. He didn't want more champagne or blankets. What he wanted, what he suddenly craved, was distance, from the truth, from the name, from the possibility that fate had wrapped him in the very justice he thought he had escaped. A memory clawed its way back unbidden. His father's voice, cold and sharp, control people by reminding them of their place. Derek had lived by it, wielded it like a weapon. But now he wondered, what if he was the one being reminded of his place? The intercom crackled. Malik's voice returned, steady, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got smooth skies ahead. I'll be monitoring conditions closely, but rest assured, you're in capable hands." The words should have comforted. For everyone else, they did. Passengers smiled faintly. Children shifted in their sleep. The couple in row 5 whispered with relief. But to Derek, those words carried weight heavier than steel. Capable hands. The son's hands. Hands that had been raised by the woman he had mocked. His chest tightened. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't breathe right. Every calm syllable from the cockpit was a mirror, forcing him to see the ugliness he had always ignored. He thought of Ida again. Her bent shoulders. Her tired smile. Her silence under his cruelty. He had believed silence was weakness, but now he understood. It was strength. It was restraint. It was a kind of power he had never possessed, and her son, the pilot, had inherited it. Derek pressed a hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, shame burned through him hotter than pride. He saw himself as the passengers had seen him, loud, cruel, pathetic. He saw himself as his father would have seen him now, collapsing. But most of all, he saw himself as Ida must have seen him, another spoiled man shouting at the world because he had nothing else to offer. He opened his eyes again, staring into the window's reflection. His face looked older, harsher. The smirk was gone. In its place was a man he barely recognized. A man unraveling at 35,000 feet. The plane hummed on, indifferent to his collapse. The engines roared with purpose. The captain's voice faded back into silence. And Derek sat in row 3A, a king stripped of his crown, shaking quietly while the rest of the world slept. The terminal was nearly empty now. Lights glowed dimmer. Announcements grew sparse, and the echo of rolling suitcases faded into the night. Ida sat alone in the break room, her shift finally over. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, but she didn't complain. She never had. She slipped off her blazer, folded it neatly on the chair beside her, and wrapped both hands around a warm cup of tea. Steam rose, curling into the quiet air. The silver wings pinned to the fabric glinted faintly in the fluorescent light, catching her eye. She smiled softly, brushing a thumb across them. Her co-workers had already gone home. The airport was hers now, silent, cavernous, almost holy. She could hear her own breathing, steady and calm, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to lean back, to close her eyes. The traveler's voice still lingered in memory, sharp as glass. His laughter, his words, his cruelty. But she did not replay them with pain. She replayed them with a strange calm, because she knew something he did not. Her son was flying him through the sky. Malik, her boy who once built paper airplanes from torn notebook pages. Her boy who stayed up late to finish homework at the kitchen table while she counted tips and balanced overdue bills. Her boy who grew into a man disciplined enough to command the sky with silence, the kind of silence she had taught him. She imagined him now, sitting in his cockpit seat, hands steady on the controls. He didn't know what had happened at the gate. She hadn't told him, hadn't needed to. He didn't need stories of cruelty to understand who she was. He had seen her strength every day of his life, and that was her victory. Not revenge, not shouting back, not lowering herself to meet the man's cruelty, but raising a son who didn't need arrogance to prove his worth, raising a son who could lift hundreds of strangers into the sky with grace and competence, while the man who mocked her sat powerless in row 3A. She sipped her tea slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. For once, the aches in her body seemed lighter. The humiliation she had endured was just noise, passing and hollow. But the legacy she had built, the man her son had become, that was permanent. In the quiet of the break room, she whispered to herself, "I did right by him." The words were simple, but they filled her like a hymn. Outside the window, she could see the faint glimmer of a plane climbing higher, lights blinking like stars in motion. She didn't know if it was Malik's, but she chose to believe it was. She always believed in him. And somewhere inside that plane, a man who thought he had broken her was learning what real power looked like. Ida didn't need to witness it. She didn't need to know the details. Her victory had already taken root, because dignity, once planted, grows in silence. And through Malik, her dignity now soared higher than any insult could reach. The cabin had grown still again, lulled into the strange half-silence of cruising altitude. The engines droned, steady and eternal, like the heartbeat of the sky itself. Derek sat frozen in row 3A, staring at the seat back in front of him, his arrogance dissolved into something smaller, frailer. Around him, passengers dozed, crew moved quietly, the world carried on. But inside him, everything had cracked. He thought again of the gate, the old woman's face, the badge, the wings. He had mocked them as decoration, trinkets pinned to a uniform meant for someone beneath him. But now, high above the world, he understood. Those wings were not decoration. They were inheritance. He imagined her pressing them against her chest after he had spat cruelty at her. He remembered how steady she had looked, even when her hands trembled. And then he thought of her son, Captain Malik Johnson, carrying his own pair of wings in the cockpit. Real wings, earned through sacrifice, discipline, legacy. 2 sets of wings, one dulled with age, one gleaming in uniform, both born from the same quiet strength. In the cockpit, Malik reached into his pocket during a lull, fingers brushing the pin he always carried. He didn't even realize he'd done it. It was instinct, a ritual. His thumb traced the edges of the silver wings, and for a moment, the cockpit seemed to dissolve. He was back in their kitchen, paper airplanes scattered across the table, his mother's voice teaching him balance. He smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "Still flying with me, Mama," he whispered. The plane held steady, guided by his hands, guided by her lessons. In the break room at the airport, Ida finished her tea and tucked her blazer into her bag. The silver wings glinted faintly as she folded the fabric, the pin catching one last shimmer of fluorescent light, before disappearing into shadow. She carried them carefully, the way one might carry something sacred. For Ida, the wings were not just a gift from her son. They were proof that all the years of sacrifice had taken flight, proof that dignity, even in silence, could grow into something unstoppable. Passengers on Flight 227 stirred slightly as turbulence rocked the cabin. Some tightened seatbelts, some clutched armrests. Derek gripped his own seat, pulse racing. Every bump felt like a message. Every shudder reminded him that his fate was in the hands of the son of the woman he had tried to break. But Malik's voice soon returned, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, just a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about. Keep your seatbelts fastened, and we'll be through it shortly." The cabin exhaled relief. The turbulence eased, and Derek, still gripping his armrest, understood at last. His power had always been an illusion. The real power belonged to those wings. One pair pinned to a tired blazer, another carried close to a pilot's heart. The wings were not decoration. They were justice. The city lights glittered below, scattered like 1,000 jewels on black velvet. Flight 227 descended smoothly, the engines shifting pitch as Malik guided the aircraft with steady hands. Passengers stirred awake, fastening belts, adjusting blankets, preparing to return to the world below. In row 3A, Derek sat stiff, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away. He had spent the last hours in silence, haunted by the knowledge of who sat in the cockpit. Each announcement from Malik's calm voice had been another weight pressing down, another reminder of the truth. The man he had mocked through his mother now held his life, quietly, firmly, without ever raising his voice. The wheels touched down with a soft roar, the plane shuddering slightly before gliding down the runway. Applause rippled through the cabin, polite, grateful, relieved. Malik's voice returned, warm and measured. "Welcome to your destination, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of myself and the crew, thank you for flying with us. It's been our honor to carry you safely." The words were ordinary, yet they rang differently in Derek's ears. To him, they sounded like judgment, not cruel, not vengeful, simply absolute. As the jet bridge locked into place and the cabin lights brightened, passengers rose, stretching, collecting their belongings. Derek stayed seated a moment longer, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because someone had shouted him down, but because silence had shown him his true size. Grace passed by, smiling at passengers, thanking them for their patience. When she reached Derek, he tried to muster his old smirk, but it faltered. His voice came low, almost broken. "The captain, does he always sound that calm?" Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "Always," she said, and she moved on. Derek stood slowly, pulling his bag from the overhead bin. He shuffled down the aisle, no longer striding like a king. The cabin door stood open, and for a heartbeat, he glanced toward the cockpit. The door was still closed, but he felt the weight behind it, the steady presence of Malik Johnson, the son of the woman he had humiliated. He lowered his eyes and walked off the plane. Back at the airport, Ida stepped outside into the night air, her shift finished. The breeze was cool, gentle against her face. She carried her blazer over one arm, her silver wings glinting faintly in the dim light. She didn't know what had happened in the sky. She didn't need to, because as long as her son carried his wings, she carried hers. And together, they proved that dignity could outfly arrogance every time. A family walking past brushed shoulders with her. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, she looks important." Her mother smiled. "She is." Ida's lips curved softly, her eyes glancing upward at the faint streak of a plane crossing the stars. Her son was still in the sky. Her wings were still with him. And the man who had tried to strip her dignity had left with none of his own. Because true victory had never been about shouting louder. It had always been about flying higher,